History Criminology project, in conjunction with the ASC, is proud to present a conversation with Janet Lauritsen. It's March 26, 2015, and we are recording this from Rick Rosenfeld's office, and been kind enough to grant us space at the University of Missouri at St. Louis. Just a brief recount of, for those of you who may not be somewhat familiar with Dr. Lauritsen's work, a brief recollection of sort of the highlights of her career. Dr. Lauritsen began her studies, and actually concluded her studies, at one place, the University of Illinois, where she studied sociology. And she now informs me that sociology was sort of a late interest in terms of her undergraduate career, finishing her BA in 1982, an MA in 1984, and her PhD in 1989. Her dissertation concerned the title of her dissertation was Adolescent Sexual Behavior and Early Childbearing, Empirical Tests of Social Control and Strain Theories. She began her victimization research shortly after she concluded her dissertation research with an NIJ postdoc. Apparently postdocs were rather prevalent at that particular day and age, under the direction of Dr. Sampson, Rob Sampson.
That's correct.
She was then hired on as an assistant professor at the University of Missouri at St. Louis in 1990, where she is now. She, via climbing the academic ranks, attained the title of Curator's Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And if memory serves, that's actually an appointment by the governor?
By the system of the University of Missouri.
And she also simultaneously serves as a visiting research fellow at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the U.S. Department of Justice. And you've had several stints, several multi-year stints.
That's correct. Still ongoing.
Okay. She's earned quite a bit of recognition here at the University of Missouri at St. Louis, both for her scholarship as well as her accolades on the teaching end of the spectrum. She's earned the Governor's Award for Excellence in Teaching from the state of Missouri in 2002, and she's also attained and earned the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Research in 2012. In terms of the field at large, she has served the National Consortium of Violence Research from 1997 to 2008. She and Rick Rosenfeld authored a really interesting piece, a rebuttal to a report that attempted to classify particular cities as more or less dangerous. In context, the Claude S. Fisher Award, awarded for that co-authored piece in 2010, the inaugural year for that particular award. She's been named National Associate of the National Research Council, the National Academy of Sciences in 2011, and most recently she has been named as a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology in 2013. In terms of her research scope, it primarily pertains to victimology. She's done quite a body of work with the National Crime Victimization Survey. She'll speak to us about various aspects of that research endeavor, that prolonged research endeavor. You've also dealt with the British Crime Survey, the National Youth Survey, and a number of other common data sets. She's dealt with crime trends, intimate partner violence, quite a few methodological issues you've encountered and grappled with over the course of your career. Neighborhood contextual effects, gender, race and victimization, victim-offender overlap, as well as repeat victimization. Now, I think before we get to sort of the body and the specifics of some of the contributions that you've made in the literature, it might be helpful to give us an idea here in terms of your biography and maybe how you made it into the orbit of criminology from computer science.
That's an interesting question to reflect on, and it was never a plan of mine to become a criminologist, nor was it really a plan to become a sociologist. I had studied math and computer science up until the middle of my junior year in college at the University of Illinois, and I decided at that point that it was becoming a little too abstract and a little too disengaged from the world. And I remembered at the time it was also getting extremely difficult and bringing me no joy. And so I I remembered that my favorite classes and my electives were sociology, and so what I did is I switched majors very late, and I crammed in essentially the equivalent of 2 years worth of full-time sociology in the last 3 semesters of my undergraduate career. And I loved it. And so I just loved the application of empirical methods and to the objective ways in which sociologists were looking at the world and the different kinds of things they were looking at. So I finished that degree, but graduated at the height of the early 1980s recession in the U.S. And there really weren't very many jobs, but I was very fortunate to have some really great professors at undergrad who simply asked me one day, why don't you go to graduate school? We have an assistantship for you, and you can work in this quantitative lab that we have, the social science quantitative lab at the University of Illinois. So apply. Okay. And I said that'd be great. And I was so excited, first generation college student, I was so excited to hear that they were going to pay for my education. I couldn't believe it. And so I also had not many alternatives, so I took that assistantship. Okay. And then I studied sociology in graduate school and continued to love it. What happened is, in my program, is that when I started the program, students were expected to focus on 2 areas and to test in 2 areas. But then they consolidated that to 1. And I had lots of interests in sociology. I was fascinated by stratification, by demography, by social psychology, and actually less so by criminology until later on in my graduate education, when I realized, when I took a couple courses and became fascinated by the topic of deviance and social control. And so that's when I decided that I was going to take my exams in just one field, in criminology. And fortuitously, at that point, Rob Sampson joined the faculty. And so
Could you speak to us a little bit about the intellectual environment of the University of Illinois?
It's fabulous.
Many people may not be aware of the fact that it did have a reputation at one particular point in time, in particular, for having sort of a menagerie of criminologists.
It was fabulous, I thought. It had, at one point in time, overlapping and crisscrossing both the end of my undergrad and the beginning of my grad school years. It had Michael Gottfredson, Rita Simon, David Bourgeois, Ken Land, Marcus Felsen, and Rob Sampson. And I'm sure I'm leaving someone out, but it was a lot of crisscrossing of talent. I just got lucky. I was there at the right time with some real intellectual powerhouse, who of course were not necessarily known at the time. A lot of them were assistant professors, but I was really fortunate to be able to work with and to be in contact with them. At the same time, I also loved the other areas of emphasis in sociology, and you're forced to be broad and take more coursework than I think crim students are encouraged to take today. And so I studied with ethnomethodologists, social psychologists, collective behavior theorists, and stratification people too. So I really enjoyed the range of intellectual thought that was going on there at the time. It's just really great.
So going a little bit out of order in a sense here, do you think your experience, your immersion into computer science has made you kind of I don't know, I hate to use the term data geek, but certainly somebody who's immersed in data, understands data and methodology and how to extract what you want from that?
I know it helped.
Especially in this earlier day and age.
Right. It was old school back then. Yeah. And I know that I was one of the few students, for example, I think one of the reasons they told me to apply to graduate school is because after I had been a math and computer science major, they said, well, don't take the undergraduate stat requirements, take the grad stat requirements. And so I did, and so I was already prepared.
Okay.
And had more elective time in grad school, and so I know they hired me because they needed some graduate student to begin filling these research slots that were going on there. And I wasn't afraid of the equipment. Lots of social science. The computers were new.
Yeah.
We used mainframes and key punch cards and all sorts of old-fashioned things. And I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't afraid to struggle with it. It's just, I think, I never admitted that I knew. I never thought of myself as a genius, otherwise in computer science or math. Otherwise, I would have been able to keep that major. But I did know enough about application at that point and how to try to start using it and thinking that way. So I think that was definitely a reason that I was encouraged to go to graduate school.
There were a couple of, segues I see from the point of your dissertation to victimology. So you go from a dissertation that's oriented around deviance, and then you move to criminology, and then you get to victimology. With someone like Lauritsen on the faculty there, I have to ask if that was kind of influential in some way in terms of...
Actually, yeah, sure. Michael Gottfredson, I'm sure he doesn't remember, I took a course with him, and it was a team-taught course on survey research. It was a 2-semester course, and they actually required the graduate students to collect survey data as a telephone survey, and some of it was about victimization and beliefs about crime and perceptions and things like that. And I do remember him saying to me, I said, I'm not sure I'm interested in criminology. He said, what are you interested in? And I think I said something like, well, early childbearing or something. And he said, that's criminology. And I said, I think you're right. Especially because everything I had been reading at the time was about, essentially I viewed it as the labeling of bad girls.
Okay.
So when girls would engage in adolescent sexual behavior, they were being labeled as bad girls, whereas the boys were just being boys.
Okay.
And I couldn't help but think of Travis Hershey's theory of people do things. The question is, why doesn't everybody do it? And so I was fixated on this issue of this double standard against girls and versus boys when it came to the big concern at the time, which was why it was teenage childbearing, non-marital childbearing, and adolescent sexual behavior. But I really did study a little bit of victimology before I started the postdoc, because I worked for Rob Sampson for 2 years on his projects before the postdoc as an RA.
All right.
And he and I worked on a paper that's when we did the British Crime Survey paper.
Oh.
So I was working on my dissertation and with him on a paper from the British Crime Survey, and that's how, and he of course was came from Albany with Michael Hindelang and John Laub, and worked on crime survey data before. So there was some sort of a stream that made it seem to me to be a natural part of what it was criminologists do, although not many were doing it at the time.
Now, how much victimology existed at that point? And can you speak to us a little bit about the expansion of that element of the field?
I wouldn't say we used really the word victimology at all.
The National Crime Survey was around. It was being used and
it had been used, and it was very difficult to use, and so it had only been used by a few of the famous early criminologists in that area, like Hindelang and Cohen and Felsen and Cohen, Klugel and Land, all of whom had been at Illinois, interestingly. But they, the other aspects of victimization were political at the time. They weren't empirical. They were feminist arguments about, there are these crimes out there that the NCS at the time is not measuring well at all.
Okay.
And that was there was a battle, an empirical battle from the feminist saying that we don't have any value in that data. So
Yeah.
what you had was this bifurcated origins, I think, of the feminists who are concerned about helping women,
Mhm.
and you had these initial early users of NCS who were just trying to describe patterns
Okay.
and do more of a hardcore empirical analysis, whereas this was much more of a political and
All right.
harm minimizing effort on the part of feminists. So it was really, there wasn't a field, there was no
Yeah.
engagement between these groups at
Okay.
all, as far as I can tell.
And so over the years, I suspect that the interest in this subject matter began to grow, and then there began a term that
Yes,
you were able to center a conversation around,
right.
and then some themes emerge, and then you have empirical backing to test particular propositions,
That's
et
right.
cetera.
As data grew, especially as the use of survey data grew, there were more and more opportunities to study victimization per se than in the past. Because if you look at all the old criminology classics in the
Yeah.
field, there's not much mention of victimization
Yeah.
at all in the
Yeah.
field. There is only in the beginning, in the 40s and 50s, when Marvin Wolfgang started talking about victim precipitation, do you really have any attention
Mhm.
to victimization? And even there, it's the attention is really about a new type of offender, the
Okay.
offender who brings it on himself.
Okay.
But as far as considering it as a subject matter in its own right, I don't think that really took off until later in the 90s.
Okay.
Actually.
Now, there's an intersection that you pointed us to here in terms of policy versus science here.
Mhm.
Can you give us a little bit about how that debate has maybe
Yeah.
played itself out?
Mhm. In my opinion, well, that's a tough one. I
Yeah.
think there's a whole
Yeah.
book in that topic, because I think without there's been sort of an antagonistic relationship between science and victim advocates and what they're trying to do. There's been a suspicion of the numbers from the advocates, and actually for good reason,
Yeah.
because they could be used in all sorts of unhelpful ways to them.
Yeah.
What I see is that clash was really strong and serious and kind of destructive in the early years. There was in my opinion, there was an early view by some feminists, and I consider myself a feminist of a different sort, of a more of a positivist, Wendy Kaminer type of feminist. But I think what happened is, as more women got into the field, honestly, there was more sensitivity to the kinds of issues that women and advocates were concerned with, and there was a better blending of science and advocacy.
Did that maybe allay some of the suspicion that some
That it's-
advocates may have had?
Some of it, but there's still an older school of thought that is dismissive of empirical analyses. They're more interested in helping and in documenting the experience of victimization. And even in the beginning of those debates, there were scholars who were heckled for even studying the correlates of, say, women's risk for intimate partner violence, because they couldn't see how that information would be useful other than for blaming the victim.
Right.
And so they didn't want to see that kind of research.
Yeah.
They wanted to see other forms. But over time, I think that's gotten so much better, and I think there's a new generation of young women that I see in agencies and in advocacy organizations who really want to learn using empirical data how to improve services, how to evaluate service, how to better target specific groups, and how to figure out why some things are working and some things aren't working. But that's new, in my opinion.
Yeah. Some of your early work, especially with the victim-offender overlap, were really like dead center in the middle of kind of parsing out that element. And I'm wondering, by implication, does that make theorizing about this particularly difficult?
Yeah, I think so. Well, it depends what you're trying to predict in terms of your theory, or trying to understand in terms of your theory.
Yeah.
Studying the victim-offender overlap was problematic too in the
Yeah.
time, if you notice, when we study offenders, we've rarely had information on their victimization
Yeah.
and vice versa. And
Okay.
similarly, in studies of victims of crime, there's rarely any information about their offending.
Yeah.
That is the case, even though it is the strongest correlate
Yeah.
of victimization, and it's puzzled me why, not puzzled completely, but as social scientists, we need to try to figure out what that's about.
Yeah.
I don't think we should just ignore this fact. Let's
Okay.
figure out what this is about, and figure out what factors might moderate that relationship. Because it's certainly not true that all victims are offenders or vice versa. But there is this strong correlation that needs to be understood. And I can't think of any other correlate in criminology of offending where it's simply not, that's so strong and yet not considered in any of the in most models that are out there.
All right.
I think that's gotten better.
Okay.
But it's definitely a challenge. But back to the question of theorizing about victimization, it's hard to theorize about things that happen to people.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because they're not engaged
All
in necessarily in meaningful action
All right.
directed towards that outcome.
All right.
And so that's because we tend to think about victimization strictly at the individual level, as an
Yeah.
individual level matter, like why are some people more likely to be victims than others. But I think if we think more broadly about victimization as something that emerges out of situations or social contexts, or something that has changed in its frequency over time, we can step back and look at it with more objectivity and theorize about it in different ways.
Okay.
Kind of like the automobile safety industry, right? We know there are people we know there are accidents. We know
Yes.
the number of accidents vary
Okay.
over time, that the deaths from traffic accidents go down.
All right.
We know there's things we can do to help people minimize the harm.
Okay.
Like put in seat belts and guardrails and things like that.
Okay.
And we also know that there are plenty of people who bring accidents on themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
But knowing that still means that we can approach the more macro questions from a different theoretical orientation. Say, let's figure out how we can reduce this phenomenon occurrence, as well as reduce the harm resulting from it.
Okay. Without involving the matter of implying blame or the motivating element there, right? The element of volition.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's why it's not the same kind of theorizing
Okay.
that I think most criminologists are used to doing, because they were studying offending and
That's
deviant.
interesting.
Mhm.
Okay. You also mentioned a little bit here in terms of this multi-level aspect of looking at this. You've done enormous amounts of work on this. I'm thinking back to your chapter in Understanding and Preventing Violence. You and Samson take 100 pages there and dice this up in a variety of different ways. Is there any potential to overcome those divisions in terms of levels of measurement?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is greater appreciation and now greater ability to study things in multi-level ways. Study incidents nested within persons, persons nested within communities, communities nested in historical and national contexts.
All right.
And I think we finally are starting to accumulate a lot of data over the years in victimization, where we can take a bigger look at what's been happening over time. So, for example, linking individual level theories to the larger macro level theories about crime and victimization, that integration is something that I'm struggling with and working on with Karen Heimer.
Yeah.
She and I are studying long-term trends in victimization and trying to link the phenomenon at both the micro and the macro level.
Okay.
And so that's a big project that we've been working on for years, but haven't quite yet finished.
That's a very much of an empirical endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you see, or if you would forecast that producing new theoretical insights. Will it upset sort of the status quo or the accumulated wisdom on particular points? Is it doing that now?
I don't think it will upset. Well, there's always
Well,
someone's going to be upset if they don't like
maybe
what you
upset's the
find.
wrong word. Well, would there have to be some readjustment or refining to maybe existing
Yeah,
theory?
yeah, I think so. One of the simplest questions, because we haven't had the capacity to study this, one of the simplest questions is, for example, why is a particular correlate associated with victimization risk at the individual level? So why, for instance, are males at higher risk for general violent victimization?
Yes.
And certainly stranger violent victimization. And we theorize about that excessively, and yet have never asked the question, well, has that gap changed over time? Because we haven't had the data that involved the consistent methodology over time, which would allow us to say, you know what, that gap is closed now.
Okay.
And and that suggests that the meaning of gender,
All right.
or the activities and assorted correlates of being male or female in the United States, has changed in some way over the last 40 years, because what used to be a very large gap is now gone.
Okay.
And so that forces someone who's been stuck strictly in an individual level method of saying something else is going on here. It can't just be all individual level factors associated with some inherent gender characteristic. Something bigger is going on here.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do is we're trying to study things differently, in the sense that we're trying to study people nested in time and history, and ask whether there's been first of all, whether there's been a declining significance of gender, declining significance of race,
All right.
declining or not declining significance of poverty,
All right.
On terms of the distribution of victimization in the population.
Okay.
And that requires us to link both what we call microdata, person data, to what's going on in the nation. It's been quite an enormous challenge.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have help also from Joe Lang at the University of Iowa.
Okay. Does the BJS facilitate some of that kind of?
No, that work actually was supported by NIJ and then later by NSF.
Okay.
BJS work has facilitated other projects, but not those.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We'll touch on that in a moment here.
Mm-hmm.
Before we do so, a little bit more about these sort of intellectual interplay between various camps, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of your work is at the crossroads of offending and victimization here, and victimology and criminology.
Mm-hmm.
You've written a little bit. There's a really interesting piece that you did, maybe 6 pages in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology at one point, maybe 5-6 years ago.
Okay.
Where you give a really nice rendition here of how criminology has benefited from victimology, and how much you were encouraging criminology to begin the process of incorporating more victimology into it. Can you give us a little bit more about the developments in terms of...
Thanks for reading that. I've found over the years, and maybe it's less so today, that when you say you study victimization, it's almost like, oh, you just study this small aspect of crime. That's not really the important aspect, which is offender motivation.
Yeah.
And then there's so much criminology is based on data that goes beyond consideration of what victims have to say about crime. And so what I tried to do in that piece is say, look, here are at least 100 things that we know about crime that we wouldn't know about crime if it weren't for the fact that the wise persons on the President's Commission of Crime in 1967 decided we need more data on crime besides police data.
Yes.
And it led to the development of the National Crime Panel, National Crime Survey. And from that we learned how much crime is reported to the police, how much crime involves victim offender different constellations, how much involves weapons, how much is this or that. And and with those kinds of data, we can study, and in no other way that I can think of, for example, whether police arrest data are biased.
Yeah.
So I think most criminologists have incorporated all that information into them without thinking that that actually is from victimization research that we know that. It's not from studies of offenders. It's studies from, and it's another source of data about crime.
Yeah.
And it just happens to be the victim's perspective rather than the criminal justice system's perspective or the offender's perspective. It's actually how crime looks to victims, which are much more common than offenders.
Okay.
So,
I'm wondering from an outsider looking into victimology here, if the fact that the NCVS is such a dominant resource, and many perceive it to be atheoretical in terms of the things that it draws from, largely because it's so politically charged that it's just a basic descriptive analytic piece. Does that limit the ability of victimology to introduce items that would strike the criminological ear as being interesting?
I think that argument is certainly out there, but that it's sort of misinformed and out of date now.
Okay.
Fortunately.
Yeah.
As there was some truth to it it's for some time. I think there were lots of things that could be done with the data if it's used creatively. And fortunately, right now, the agency, BJS, is undergoing a massive redesign of the NCVS for the future. And this involves a lot of caretaking and a lot of assessments of what does need to be included on there, what can be included on there, what's the purpose of the survey, what the cost restraints are on the survey, what's the how much error would this kind of change in the methodology introduce into the estimates. All those kinds of complex issues have to be thought out very carefully. It's been going on for a couple of years now, and so that the new survey can be more responsive to what the government agencies call stakeholders, which include victims groups and victim service providers as well as academics. We're not the only ones with data needs out there, so we can't have everything we want. So we need to make our arguments smart and clear and convincing to.
You wrote a really nice piece, I think it was also on JQC, about the behind-the-scenes elements there, and introducing things like how do we get information on who's developmentally disabled, the hate crimes and the bias crimes there, and introducing some of the elements there, and sort of the push and pull with some of those items. Is that going to play itself out here again, or what kinds of things are?
Yes.
Because I suspect that those aren't necessarily all that interesting or germane to what a tried and true criminologist might be pushing for.
Right. The criminologist didn't push for either of those at all.
Right.
Those were victim advocacy efforts and congressional legislation mandates.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I was so lucky to learn about that, and I'm still learning about that, because I think one of the things that criminologists don't do is spend enough time understanding data and where it comes from and what the social processes behind this production involve. And when I started working with, actually I'll just back up 1 second. I started working only with NCVS right after I got tenure.
Okay.
Which was fortuitous for me because I wasn't interested, as you said. There were limits in the data set. I couldn't think of what I would do with it that would answer the kinds of questions I was most interested in at the time, which were these contextual, compositional questions. And so when Jan Chaikin was director of BJS and Al Bloomstein was PI of the NCOVR project, they had brokered an agreement that would allow some access to the area identified NCVS. I was tenured, which was fortunate at the time because I was allowed to gain access to these data, but the condition was they had to be it was a long ordeal. I won't bore
Sure.
anybody with that, but I had to do the research about in Pittsburgh, and 600
Okay.
miles away from home, and pay for every minute I was on the computer. And so it's stress producing and everything. But anyway, and it was very time consuming and
Yeah.
tedious, and there were lots of people who helped me try to get this work done. But it was a long setup time. It's from the start of the approval process to gain access to this data in a secure facility to my first publication. It was 4 years.
All right.
And that's not the kind of time people have when they're untenured.
Yeah.
So once I had done that and I had a series of analyses out of that set, then I started wondering about all these methodological decisions that were made by who? How does this happen? Why can't I have a question? Can I get a question on that survey? How does that work? And that's when I applied to BJS for the first fellowship.
All right.
And in which I said I'd like to study the methodological history of the survey and how it is that these decisions got made. So when they said yes, this is Larry Greenfeld, who was then director of the agency. He and Mike Rand were very generous, and they would let me look in their file cabinets at memos between, say, senators and the Justice Department, between the Census Bureau and the BJS, between LEAA in the old days and stuff. And I was overwhelmed at the behind-the-scenes infrastructure and operations and politics and that are going on to sustain this survey, and how difficult and challenging it was, and so that social production of knowledge is something that we just really lack in the field historically. Jim Lynch and Al Biederman, there's not many people who know this
the inside
history,
story.
right? And so it'd be nice to get that down for posterity's sake someday, because these folks, we all aren't here forever, and that process of just learning why did those questions get added and I can't add my own question. That's what that was about.
Is there any connection between the area identified release at that particular point in history and the more recent round of work that you've been doing with a colleague at Arizona State?
Min Shea?
Yeah, with the NSA work. Is there any real connection between? Did it learn from that experience? Did it know that it benefited from that, and then it made a concerted effort to?
Well, interestingly, that metropolitan area, I learned to work with the metropolitan area data incidentally while I was at BJS doing this methodological history.
Right.
They knew I had worked with the area identified, the statisticians at the time, and they said, here's a data file of the 40 largest MSAs for 20 years that Census put together, and we don't have time to analyze this. Are you interested in working this? And I was so excited. I said yes, and that's how I learned to originally work with the file, and because I'd worked with that file, that's how I started working with Min Shea, and she and I had done a few things together with that data, but none of this was planned.
Right.
I didn't plan NCBS. The only thing I planned was the application to BJS, but to try to understand that background information. And then they delivered this data file, which made me very excited.
This is actually a really nice segue into an issue or the benefit of being able to work with. Well, you've worked with a veritable who's who of collaborators. Rob Sampson, John Lobb, Eric Baumer, Richie Felsen, Jim Lynch, Julie Horney, and Karen Eimer most recently. Could you speak to us about those interactions and how that's produced?
It's amazing to me when I think back, like how I got so lucky. None of it was planned. That's all I can say, is that none of it was planned. I'm not sure if these kinds of things can happen anymore. The world was much smaller. The chronological world was much smaller back then. Rob Sampson, I didn't go to Illinois to study with him. He came after
Yeah.
I was there.
Yeah.
How lucky was that? And actually, the reason I met John is that John Laub is that he and Rob Sampson were working together. They had just discovered the Gluck data,
Yeah.
and I was working for Rob on the British Crime Survey project, and I didn't have a job after graduation because it was again the recession of the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s. There weren't many jobs. And he said, "Oh, well, we're working on a grant. We'll write you in as a postdoc, and if we get lucky, you'll have some work to do." And that's John was a consultant on that postdoc, and so that's how we got hooked up on the victim offender overlap stuff. And they were very, very young then. They're not much old. They're only a couple years older than me. They became great friends, but they're also very smart. So how lucky is that to have very smart, thoughtful colleagues at a young age? But then, who did I work? Oh, Eric Baumer and Rich Felsen, Julie Horney. Rich Felsen and Julie Horney I started working with through NCOVR. I met them at NCOVR, and they were interested in doing a paper on some other aspect of the area identified.
Right. I think you were doing something with Elijah Anderson stuff. It was
Right.
really kind of cool.
Find out whether or not crime is any different in just the highly disadvantaged areas versus the nature of crime is any different there. Yeah. So that's how I met them. Became friends with them too. It's fun working with them. Eric Baumer was a master's student. I hired him as a RA one year to do some neighborhood drive-arounds in a local area, and then he left to get his PhD at Albany, and then we hired him when we came back. So he and I worked with NCVS because he and I had also done some work with the area identified, and we're still working. Working together.
On the police report study that just is so
changing
comprehensive.
Right, that's mostly Eric's doing. Okay. And then the work with Karen Heimer was later in the career, and inevitably because one of the things I had begun to notice in the trend data was that the gender gap in victimization was closing.
Okay.
And I knew that, and I did not know Karen. Even though she and I actually graduated at the same time, and
she was at Wisconsin and you were
at Illinois, right, and it was closing, and I wondered what she thought of that, because she had studied the closing of the gender gap in offending, and so I read her piece in the NIJ 2000 report, and then I think I just contacted her and said, "You want to have lunch at ASC and I want to talk about this. Are you interested?" And I think it took a little bit of convincing, but she's hooked and really smart, and we work very well together. So I'm very happy to have found such another great colleague.
Yeah. Over the course of your career, and over the course of many people's careers, oftentimes find that there's resistance or pushback. There are sort of more or less sacred or ensconced truths that sometimes people find upsetting. Have you ever encountered debates or argument or kind of tug of war, pushback, dialogue that produces hopefully a more enlightened understanding there?
Yeah, I've gotten into some debates with people in the literature, and so there are issues that people have become convinced about that one might challenge, and you should expect some pushback on
certainly.
that. But ultimately, it's a question of, in my view, it's just a question of a balancing of. I never tried in any of those critiques I've written or replies or comments on paper to take down anybody's body of work. What I've tried to do is say, this isn't exactly how I understand it or we understand this issue, and here's why.
Okay.
And we want to bring that to the attention of criminologists and let them think about it too.
Okay.
Because we're certainly not the final word on anything,
Right.
or I'm not the final word on anything. But there are a lot of issues that I've cared about, like the gender gap in offending and victimization, or like the quality of self-report data
Yeah.
and longitudinal data, or the availability, the public availability of publicly funded data sets.
Okay.
All important things.
Have
to
those
me.
been fruitful debates? Have they produced?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't think anything bad has happened.
Right.
I mean, other than, getting thicker skin, but I think it's been fine.
Okay. Have there been changes maybe that have produced?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
I think not because of my
Right.
comments. I think.
Well, I think with maybe some of the redesign aspects of NCBS or
Yeah.
some of the things that you may have promoted there that.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've had some impact on that.
Yeah.
I certainly have had a lot of discussions about it, and I just want to say though that in terms of like sort of this oral history and researchers and what they do and things, I think it's fascinating. I love watching other people's oral history and stories, but I think of the kind of work that I do in science more as a real collective enterprise,
Yes.
especially because
Yeah.
of the nature of the data I've been working
Yeah.
with in the last 20 years. There is no single giant upon whom all shoulders stand. I mean, or however, or
Right.
upon whose shoulders we all stand. And in victimization research, there are lots of really smart people
Yeah.
in this area. And one of the things I've been impressed with is the give and take, and in discussions with like statisticians at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, these people are extremely smart, extremely careful and thoughtful, and so I'm sure I've learned more from them than they've learned from me. And so if between all sorts of communications with not just me but other people, they've come to make improvements. I'm happy to play a small part in that process, but it really is a big social process.
Yeah.
And it's not, I'm just happy to be where someone needed to be on victimization right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Or just to be called in.
Just
to be
invited
invited into the
in.
conversation.
Exactly.
to say.
It's like, well, here's some cool things that I think have happened, and that's really exciting, and oh, that's kind of exciting, but here's why I don't think that's going to work.
Right.
Given my use of the data so far, here's the problems you're going to run into that are pretty formidable. And that's the kind of thing that they like to hear. They like to say, well, can we just talk to you about what you've learned from trying to do this?
Okay.
Like what hurdles you run into. And so I think that's, I certainly haven't had an agenda on that because they know they work in a different environment than academics do, and they have their own constraints that they have to make decisions under, as opposed to us with unlimited freedom, supposedly.
So, sort of a self-reflective question here in a bit of a way. Looking back on your career, are there things that you look back on with a measure of satisfaction that's something there that I'm really proud to have produced that may have had some impact in terms of maybe the development of the field? And what would those items maybe be?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to have been studying some of the right things at some of the right times, and I think I'm really pleased that I almost didn't have enough sense to know I shouldn't be studying the victim offender overlap, because that's led to a lot of I think important certainly a lot of citations, but also a lot of thinking about what is it that connects these two phenomena, and how can we maybe stop it, the connection. So I'm pleased to have helped revive that early tradition.
All right.
I'm also pleased at the amount of that some of the work that I've done on methodological issues
Yeah.
in longitudinal data has gotten serious attention. I'm not the I'm not the first person to have pointed that out, but
Yeah.
I think I was struck by how much how much we all assume about the quality of our data.
All right.
We take a methods course, we read
Yeah.
a couple books, and we think, fine, there's nothing else I got to worry about.
But that came pretty far into the progression of the
Yes.
celebration almost of longitudinal research.
Right.
It became very dominant, and we
Right.
kind of here you are saying, "Oh,
Slow down.
there might be this thing."
And here's something we should figure out
Right.
before we move further with a lot of money.
Yeah. Right.
Why is this happening, and
Yeah.
what does it mean, and how is it biasing our results or misinforming
Okay.
us? And that, I wish there were more. I have seen, actually, I think I've seen online recently a paper that revisits the issue with other data sets,
Okay.
because it may have been a unique phenomenon in the particular
Alright.
data I was looking at, although
Okay.
it certainly appears in the National Crime Victimization Survey to a lesser extent now.
All right.
It may be a function of just the age group of the people being interviewed, or
Yep.
maybe a function of other things. So I'm happy that it's caused people maybe to slow down and think at least about
Okay.
these issues, but I'm not
Alright.
sure if it's changed practice much, because still longitudinal designs, I believe they have value for some
Certainly.
questions. But I'm also I'm happy that I was able to make that area identified NCVS data project work.
Yeah.
I was never confident that it was going to be successful. I worked with Brian Wiersma of Maryland, a violence research group at Maryland, but not for him and a few
Yeah.
others. That wouldn't have happened. That I thought was a big accomplishment. In terms of just sheer persistence and
Yeah.
stubbornness. And then I'm also happy about the long-term trend stuff I'm doing with
Yeah.
Karen and the microdata analysis project that we're trying to do. It's a big task.
Whew.
We don't know if it's going to be terribly successful.
It seems almost monumental. I mean,
It
you're going
was.
back to 1973 here.
Yes.
You're combining two data sets that weren't necessarily intended to be
Right.
merged with one another.
Well, we've done it.
Yeah.
We've got over 7 million interviews linked for people out in the U.S. for 40 years now. So
Yeah.
that doesn't mean we haven't run into a massive
Yes.
set of other problems. And one of them, it's not the sheer mechanics and the statistics of it, it's really the lack of clear guidance in the
Oh.
literature about what we should expect to find.
Okay.
Like, what should we expect to find about whether or not race is significance
Okay.
in terms of victimization. We don't have many historical theories in criminology. They're all pretty ahistorical. They assume
Yeah.
we're still talking about theories that were developed in the 30s as if they apply. The concepts
Yeah.
certainly apply,
Yeah.
but the incorporation of history into it is not well laid out in the literature.
Okay.
So we're having to think back and forth. Fortunately, Karen and I are both similarly trained as
All right.
sociologists in the field, and so we think
Along similar lines,
right,
maybe?
right,
All right.
right, and we're it's not totally hopeless. We should be able to
Right.
come to some agreement about how to approach these issues, but it's a fun project. It's exciting. We know nobody else is doing it, and I like doing things that nobody else is doing.
That's pretty cool.
But then finding out there's a reason nobody else is doing them. Mhm.
Just the investment in terms of familiarizing yourself, immersing yourself with completely disparate foreign literatures almost, and then beginning the process of sort of piece by piece incorporating that, embedding that in the sort of the mainstream of criminology is
Exactly.
absolutely mind-boggling almost.
Yeah. Well, we're not done, that's for sure.
Certainly,
And
certainly.
it's probably going to take the rest of our careers to wrap that up. And as soon as we get it figured out, history will change things, and
Yeah.
we'll go back where we started. But I am proud of that accomplishment. But again, it's not that it was sheer just us and hard work. It was that we both happen to be tenured and
Right.
professors in a system that will allow us to take risks like that.
Okay. All right. you've spoken about a couple of different sort of elements of your overall repertoire.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see those as discrete? And now you want to move on from sibling criminality to maybe co-offending to now repeat victimization, or do you see them all as coherent? Is there an overarching theme there that, in your own imagination, there that defines or links these elements?
That's a good question. I think there have been several themes, but I'm not exactly sure what they are. The one theme is that if you're going to study something, you should study it every which way possible.
All right.
That's what I believe. So if you're going to study victimization, or if you're going to study whatever specific crime type, you should know every single thing there is out there to try to know about it, and to approach it from different angles to convince yourself that your understanding is solid.
Yeah.
That you understand the limits of what you know as well as the strengths of what you know. But in terms of substantive themes, I'm really interested, and Karen and I are working on this, we're really interested in this distribution of victimization, and if people are suffering the consequences of crime, that's not randomly distributed.
Right.
How do these broader social forces like history and neighborhood and poverty and inequality structure that distribution? And is it and how has that changed over time? So we're looking at, because if it wasn't, if we find that it's the exact same thing, it's been for the last 40 years, no different now than it was in 1973, that's a pretty important finding, that these are fixed.
Yeah.
These factors are of fixed importance in American society.
Yeah.
But like I say, I don't think we're finding that. Things are changing in the distribution and like the gender gap, and primarily because men are much safer than they were in the past. And women are safer, but they didn't have as far, they needed to go down quite as far in terms of stranger violence anyway.
It'd be really neat to see that body of empirical findings overlaid with the criminological findings, and see how that just sort of whets my appetite here in terms of all sorts of intellectual development. Now, throughout the interview, you've kind of suggested at various points there that you fell into things, or it was sort of fortuitous, or you did things that, in retrospect, you thought may not have been the best thing to do at a particular juncture. If you had any advice to offer to maybe the next generation of scholar here in terms of things to do or things to maybe avoid here, what kinds of things would you point to?
Well, my first answer would be, like, I'm the worst career advisor because I never had a plan. I never planned. I couldn't have predicted where I would end up.
Was that a good thing, though?
For my case, it was. But I was fortunate. Part of it's not a good strategy, I don't think, for advice. But the only thing, I was trying to think what it is that lets a scholar make a contribution, and it's focus. I think focus on a particular topic, and not just crime as a general topic, but whatever it is you're interested in about crime, stay with it, and don't give up when you think you're out of data, or don't give up when you think nobody else has a data set for you to do a secondary data analysis on. Stick with the topic, because otherwise I don't see how you can claim that you're an expert in 25 areas or even 5 areas. I mean, I can hardly keep up with the victimization literature myself, and that's just this narrowly defined component. So that's the only thing I would say. Once I found it, there are other aspects to it, but I really wanted to stay tight here and not go back to, say, studies of family dynamics or strain theory or something, unless it was to inform the victimization studies.
Maybe one way to reapproach this question or reframe it would be to ask, how have you always landed on your feet when you go from one venue to another? What is that element that makes you successful when you say that?
Besides luck?
Yeah.
I mean, luck. I mean, I look, our criminology models can barely explain 30% of the variance in anybody's outcome, so I think the same is true here in careers.
Is it because you find a new question that people find interesting, or is it you cultivating new areas? Is it a methodology maybe that you have that applies in one area that
I'm not sure. I think it's the I think that what's happened to me is I can probably link every article to a prior article, to a problem that arose in a prior article.
That's
so if you start with an interesting topic, one result leads to another set of questions. And so, for example, I never intended to study the artifact, the declines in the self-reports of victimization and delinquency. That was never my intention. What I wanted to do was study the victim-offender overlap over time within individuals to see how, whether there were persons stuck in this linked status, or whether people really did use a lot of delinquency to protect themselves if youth did that. So I then began, I'm going to look at the data this way now, and then I ran into a huge problem I couldn't figure out how to overcome, which led me to ask, well, what's going on? Why is this the problem? And the same with the gender gap and the closing of the gender gap in offending in the NCVS debate. When Karen and I were doing it, we were trying to understand why is the victimization gender gap closing, and maybe it's because the gap's closing in offending. And again, we looked at the data and we're like, well, we're not finding what other people have found with it. Why would that be the case? We can't move forward on our original problem until we solve this other problem. That's what I think probably most of my research is attempts to solve a previous problem that I ran into in another article.
It sounds as if the trick is to have the questions asked themselves.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
It's just kind of interesting the way in which that works.
Well, try not to ignore the ones that are hitting you in the face. You can't say, okay, I'm just not going to mention that anymore. I don't want to deal with that mess I just created over there. I'm going to pretend that never happened and move on to another topic. It's just not going to work.
Speaking of the mentoring process, or maybe advice to people in the abstract, certainly in the specific, you have offered advice. You've co-authored with a number of folks, some of which I went to school with there, Nicole White, Katrina Archikova, Robin Schaum, Dina Carson, and most recently Mary Beth Rizet. Hopefully I got that name right. Could you speak to us about the mentoring process and how that works and bringing along new scholars?
I'm not well. No, not well. I like students. I love to work with students who are obsessed with detail and who are interested in victimization and who really enjoy that sort of kind of the same kind of data geeky stuff, nerd stuff that I enjoy. Because that's my strength and I feel like I have something to offer them. But it's sort of a mutual blending for us. It's not that I don't feel like I'm loath to use the word mentor because I really feel like I'm training them to work the way that I think will work best for someone over their career. And that's changed for me over time, so I'm sure I hope I'm doing a better job of that now than I did 10, 20 years ago with students. I also work with more assistant professors, and that's a different. I wouldn't call that mentoring either. That's
more
young collaboration.
Yeah.
And so I'll tell them what I know, but I'm still learning from them. And if I feel like I have something to contribute to them, then I'll spend my time with them. If I feel like they can do it without me, I'll tell them straight out, you don't need me on this. I'll be happy to read a draft, but you don't need me on this. You've got this one. I'm not looking for higher publication count at this point in my career. I just want people to tackle some really substantive problems and difficult problems. The easy stuff's kind of been picked over now. It's time to study harder things.
uh, part of the part of the interest for me on the interviewer end of the spectrum here is being genuinely ignorant of things and coming in, getting to ask somebody, teach me about this. Can you give me a little bit about what you do for BJS in terms of, on my picture here, correct me if I'm wrong certainly, is that it's very much policy oriented, and I want you to maybe speak to the policy hat that you wear and how that interacts with the academic side of your genre.
Well, that is a mysterious process. I thought so too when I applied for it. I had no idea what I was getting into, but actually it's not policy at all, because unless we mean it very broadly and talk about like data analysis, policy, or questions that can be analyzed with the data. BJS is a special organization in that they're not allowed to say anything beyond the data. And so when I went there, they were looking to generate reports to maximize the utility of this data set. They were looking to see, here's what can the data support if you look at it at the metropolitan area. What can the data support if you do it? Look at this question. Can we answer this question with that? And what I do with them has changed over time. The first time it was methodological history in the MSA level data. The second time it was to the financial crisis that was facing the survey, and they thought they were going to need to either fold it, or which would be a massive loss, not just for researchers but for the country, not to have a data. I was convinced not to have a data set about crime other than what the police say, and so they had me do a series of meetings with people, methodologists, to say, let's have some meetings at BJS. Will you organize them? Will you set out the agendas? Will you help us discuss the issues in the NCBS, the methodological issues, and whether we can save any money or what do we have to do next? So that was another very different type of project. It was almost, but I learned so much from it. That's why I kept doing these things. Every time I would ask someone a question, I learned something there. It's nice to get out of the academy. And then that then ended, and then I had this, I was asked to BJS decided they wanted a full review by the National Academy of Sciences of both the NCBS and their total programs. And I was asked to serve on that panel. Jim Lynch was on that panel, Wes Scogan, Colin Lofton, Bob Groves, who was the director of Census Bureau, etc. There are lots of people on that panel. And so we did those two tests. Those took a couple of years, and during that time I had no contact with BJS, given the nature of the fact that I was evaluating what they did meant that I couldn't have contact with them. Then, after that was over, this panel handed BJS this report that said, here's what you should do with the NCBS. And here's how you should go about doing it. And in that sense, it was a policy document to the agency about how to make the data as useful and as efficient and as important as it can be. And so then when I came back, after that was released, what was shocking to all of us on the panel, first of all, I'm sure, is that one of the members, Jim Lynch, became Obama's appointee to head the agency. The other chair of the panel, Bob Groves, became Obama's appointee to head the Census Bureau. And then, of course, they had this document in hand. So here's what the National Academy did in its extensive review. They told us this is what we need to do. We need to do this. And that's when they got the infusion of money from Congress to redesign the survey. So how lucky was that to actually be on a committee where you think about things and the document actually gets used by an agency to do it. So in that sense, it was a policy, but that work on the panel was not. I was not part of the agency then. So then I went back and started to help them answer the little questions that could be answered with the available data, like how should we measure repeat victimization or prevalence of victimization or maximize the utility. So in that sense, it's mostly methodological and substantive. It's not at NIJ. It's a policy. At BJS, it's just the facts. Just the facts. No interpretation.
We've spoken at length about the collaborators, more the professional sense, but we'd be remiss if we didn't pay heed to Rick. He mentioned some of bouncing ideas off of you and that producing some important results. And I noticed more of your recent work, especially with Karen Heimer, has borrowed some of this issue of consumer sentiment and factoring in to the equation all these economic factors. And I'm kind of curious as to how much of
influence. Well, he's had a great deal of influence on my work. I'm sure I wouldn't be doing trends work if it was the way I'm doing it if it wasn't for his research in the area of crime trends and his approach. And in fact, we never worked together aside from that
context piece.
But when Karen and I were working on some of our early trends piece, we found that he and Steve Messner in Crime and the American Dream had already made some predictions about gender gap in offending, which we were surprised to find. And then I started thinking, well, maybe I should talk to him more about this work because we don't have the time to review and read each other's work. We both have our own business academic worlds. But we have many conversations, and most recently, he's chairing a roundtable of the National Academy on Crime Trends, and so I'm on that roundtable because of the victimization trend data that I have that are unique, and so I benefit a great deal from not just having him as a colleague and in my own home, but also is a colleague in Washington too, in the setting where he's bringing in all sorts of ideas about crime trends and how to study them and better understand them. But he has convinced me, reaffirmed my decision that it's worth it to stick with the crime trend stuff. Again, another thing that not enough people are studying in criminology. Because we focus so much on the individual level of analysis rather than
that and the ahistorical element there, I think, too, that you mentioned early on in the interview.
Exactly. We need to take time more seriously, history more seriously in our discipline, and begin assessing things that way.
Okay. I suppose the penultimate question here, sort of general thoughts on the intellectual state of the field or the professional state of the field. Where are we headed? Promising directions? Maybe you want to point to something there that you think needs more attention.
I do actually. I'm working on a panel for the Academy that's with Jim Lynch and many others, and he and I just wrote a piece for the Criminologist about modernizing the nation's crime statistics. This is an effort that the Academy's put together to try to modernize the entire suite of crime statistics that we have in this country. And I think it's a shame that all we have is NCBS and police data.
I'm thinking of Rick's presidential, where he prefaces a lot of this with back when the UCR was created, you could get this data relatively quickly, and now the NCVS uses the time-honored tradition of paper and pencil.
No, the UCR does, yes.
The contemporary day and age is just mystifying.
Well, so those systems need to be modernized, but the entire approach needs to be modernized. And criminologists, what happens is reality of the profession. What criminologists study is what their data is already available for. And what we don't know and should know much more about is enormous in terms of crime. We're talking about everything from white collar crime to government corruption to war crimes to Medicaid fraud to mortgage fraud to all sorts of crimes that are some regulatory, some crimes, but for which we have not the slightest clue as a country whether these are going up or down. And the future of criminology, I think, lies in the new innovations in those areas. Street crime, violent crime, and property crime in the U.S. at least appear to be at, moving toward historic low levels
Okay.
of base to me. Of course, we still have some problems, but crime seems to have been responding to target hardening.
Yeah.
In efforts, and we can harden our targets quite a bit, but there's new technologies for committing crime,
Yeah.
and new technologies for trying to solve crime, new types of crimes emerging that are still involve the use of force or fraud,
Okay.
but we're not on top of it as a discipline
Yeah.
because of the way we train our graduate students to do secondary. We have to do that, some of that, but we still also, I think, need to encourage them to please think seriously about what crime's going to look like in 10 years from now.
So that involves going out and getting new data and
Doing whatever you
asking
can.
new questions,
Mhm.
as opposed to, we have a pretty, relative to, I
Mhm.
suppose, internet crime, we have a
Right.
pretty good handle on
Starting
burglary.
that. Right,
for instance,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Okay.
But, there's all sorts of issues that are very challenging. Like, how do you count things like that? How do
Yeah.
you count hacking attempts?
Right.
How do you count crime in which, 2 million people's accounts are breached?
All right. Is that one instance or
2 million,
All
or
right.
is it one offender, or how many offenders? How do you count crime that has victims in the United States but originates in another country?
Yeah.
How do we develop? We're going to have to be more international over
Yeah.
time. We're
Yeah.
going to have to work more internationally.
Okay.
How are we going to think about these things and theorize these things and build the infrastructure that allows us to know
Yeah.
anything about these new forms?
Yeah.
And it's going to have to happen quickly. So that's
Yeah.
part of the task of this panel, is to try to think about getting ready for the next,
Huh.
building the infrastructure for the next century of what crime's
Uh-huh.
going to be like. I mean, you can imagine, for example, with technology developments and things like drones, that persons can commit crimes remotely,
Yeah.
right? So someone could do something dangerous to people or property remotely. You don't
Yeah.
even have to be connected to the person. So those kinds of issues are
Yeah.
going to involve and going to require a lot of creativity
Yeah.
on the part of criminologists, or they're going to be left behind,
Yeah.
catching up in the future. So that's what I would think the field needs to do. I think it really needs to turn towards the understudied crimes, and really put our best talent out there
Okay.
for
Yeah.
those things.
The last question, anything that we missed or that you'd like to include on the record that,
Oh gosh, no, I don't
All
think
right.
so. This was less painful than I expected it to be, so that's on the record.
Well, it's been very informative. It's been
Mhm.
very educational, learning about how victimology fits in with the larger firmament, your growth as a scholar, some of the things that you've done that have been beneficial,
Mhm.
advice to folks in future generations. So
Mhm.
we'd like to thank you for your time here.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks for asking me. It's an honor. Thank you very much.